What up, my theory creeps? I'm the Theory Creep. This is the Theory Creep, and I hope you guys are ready to creep through a little bit of theory. Today we're going to be starting with the second sustained series that we're going to be doing in this channel. Super excited about it. It's called Murder and Other Humane Acts. We're going to be dealing with laughter and humor and fear and terror. Especially we're going to be looking at horror parodies, and in particular, we're going to be looking at Aqua Teen Hunger Force, which is, in my assessment, the best horror parody out there. So I've been doing a bit of a review of other YouTube channels that look at cultural theory and critical theory and philosophy and that kind of thing. And I gotta say, I'm not really seeing a very clear expression of postmodern ideas in them. I'm seeing a lot of cultural theory and a lot of critical theory analyzing postmodern subjects like reality TV, but I'm seeing a lot of kind of implicit, modernist, enlightenment, kind of Platonic values where the cultural theorist is attempting to show you the truth. They're trying to identify a lie that the media is telling you, whether it's news media or reality television, and they're trying to give you tools to identify truth from lies. What I would like to see more people doing is giving you tools to help identify the fact that the truth is itself a lie. This idea that we can watch a piece of media that's feeding us a lie and that we can use critical theory to decode the lie and separate it from the truth, I think is kind of dangerous. The purpose of cultural theory is to give us tools to decode the myths that culture presents us with. But one myth that I'm not seeing decoded very often in these cultural theory videos is the myth of decoding. We should be challenging the possibility of discerning truth from fiction. And this brings us to Aquateen Hunger Force, a show that, through humor, gives us a ton of tools to manage the confusion and chaos of everyday living, but also to decode the myths of everyday life, the most prevalent myth being the myth of truth. This lie that we're told by everyone that we can understand the world, that we can evaluate what's going on in it, and then make rational decisions that are either right or wrong. Aqua Teen is a fragmented show. First of all, it's made of fragments. It's only 11 minutes long, which is itself a fragment of the normal length of a show, which is either 22 or 44 minutes. So Aqua Teen starts off as a piece of a piece. And within this piece, we see even more fragmentation, where plots are broken up within the 11 minutes. They're not resolved. They're not established. Storylines are picked up halfway through the episode, halfway through the story. They're just discarded without any kind of resolution. And this mirrors truth-seeking in everyday life. We try to tell stories about the world. We try to assemble narratives about what's real and what's fake. But the truth is, these stories are just that. They're myths. They never resolve into any kind of coherent conclusion. They rarely start at a natural beginning. Our attempts to understand the world are just stories, and they're often failures. And they're often profoundly inadequate. Also, Aqua Teen uses humor in a very effective way to manage this confusion and this fragmentation. And the truth is, the world is a terrifying place. It's overwhelming, it's confusing, it's challenging to understand. We never know what's real and what's not. We never know what's right and what's wrong. Often when we tell ourselves that we know what's right or what's wrong, we're in danger of lying to ourselves. So what can we do with all this confusion except laugh at it? Laughter is a passive awareness of something. When you're laughing at something, you understand it, you've absorbed it, but you're not actively engaging with it. And I think that's where the danger of self-righteousness comes from. When we think we know what's real, we're implicitly, even if we don't say it, deciding that something else is fake. There's a hierarchy in truth. But discarding truth is a scary thing to do. So laughing about the lack of truth in our lives might be an effective tool. and Aqua Teen offers us a lot of humor about this confusion. So Aqua Teen Hunger Force is a super postmodern show. It disassembles meta-narratives like plot conventions, like consistent characters. It resists a reading the way that the real world does. It's hard to understand, just like the real world is. But it's not having conniption fits over that difficulty in understanding. It's embracing the confusion and laughing at it, which again, I think is a useful tool for modern people. So one way to understand Aqua Teen Hunger Force is as a piece of existentialist or absurdist drama. We could put it in the lineage of like Tom Stoppard, Samuel Beckett, Edward Albee, Jean-Paul Sartre, Camus. And we wouldn't be wrong to do that. Aqua Teen Hunger Force conforms to a lot of the conventions of existentialist drama. All these stories, Aqua Teen included, take place in a vacuum. There's no meaning, there's no exterior systems that the characters can rely on. Anything that is outside of the characters is confusing and dangerous. And the narratives of the plays and the show are obsessed with this loneliness. They're obsessed with the vacuumous nature of reality and the fact that these characters are just trapped with each other inside this void. I think that the existentialists and the creators of Aqua Teen Hunger Force were dealing with the same kind of world. It was a world, or it is a world, with no moral center, where stories don't clearly begin, develop, and conclude. They just kind of flow into each other. There's no sense of justice or karma or right or wrong. There's no moral center. Characters aren't punished when they misbehave. And ultimately, the lack of all these things makes Aqua Teen Hunger Force a subversive piece of art. What's it subverting? Mostly, it's subverting the expectations of its audience that stories will conclude, that there are moral centers to things. It's getting us to think outside of these traditional systems. Now, this is a little bit confusing because usually when we think about a subversive piece of art, there's a very particular subject that the piece is subverting. You have like a feminist narrative that's subverting patriarchy. You'll have like a racial narrative that's subverting racial hierarchies. But Aqua Teen isn't doing anything like that. It's subverting something much larger than a particular subject. It's subverting an entire paradigm, an entire approach to truth, and to living, and to morals and right and wrong. It's subverting the self. It's subverting our assumption that we have a consistent and stable self. One of the main ways it does this is through destabilizing characters. We tend to assume the characters in a narrative are going to be consistent or they'll develop in a coherent way. But characters in Aqua Teen Hunger Force shift roles all the time. You'll have Meatwad being the victim of Shake's pranks. That's usually the way that it goes. But sometimes it's the other way around, and Meatwad tricks Shake into hurting himself profoundly. Sometimes Frylock is like a caregiving mother figure. Other times he's a selfish, abusive father figure. No one is anything in Aqua Teen Hunger Force. There's also the traditional approach to reoccurring characters that they are sympathetic. Usually characters who you see every week on a television show are the ones you root for against a reoccurring cast of antagonists or monsters or what have you. But in Aqua Teen, the monster of the week is more often than not the sympathetic one. I think the most extreme example of this is probably Old Drippy, who's the result of Shake not doing the dishes for several months and the mold growing in the sink gaining self-awareness. Now, Old Drippy is a pretty chill dude. He just wants to hang out with the Aqua Teens. He wants to be nice to them. Shake gets sick at one point, and Drippy's made of penicillin, so he encourages Shake to eat him. Finally, spoiler alert, Drippy dies when he pushes Shake out of the way of an oncoming truck. So we expect Old Drippy as a temporary monster character to be the antagonist, to be the problem in the show. But in fact, Shake is the problem in the show. He's a monster in this episode, and he really takes advantage of Drippy's kindness. Now, we could say that all Aqua Teen is doing here is reversing a traditional Saturday morning cartoon trope in an attempt to generate a cheap joke. But I think there's a lot more to it than that. I think that the show is subverting more than television tropes. It's also subverting modern epistemological tropes, modern systems through which we determine what's real and what's not. They correspond to television tropes, or television tropes correspond to them. On the surface, Aqua Teen seems very different from our world. The characters are animated fast food items. They encounter an array of super strange, absurdist monsters, two-dimensional aliens from the moon, hairy onions with spider legs, robotic rabbits, robotic turkeys. The list goes on and on. But this is the only area that the show diverges from reality. As far as the philosophical reality that Aqua Teen is presenting, it corresponds perfectly to our world. The senseless violence, the indifferent, absurd universe, the constant refusal of our life and of the show to give us a conventional developmental plot. Our stories are fragmented just like the shows are. We very rarely get a beginning, middle, and end. Often our lives are cut short right in the middle. And even within our lives, the stories that we tell ourselves, they're constructions. We look for beginnings, middles, and ends, but we aren't given them in sequence in our day-to-day lives. The stories we tell ourselves about our lives are lies. They're constructions. The world is constantly showing us that there is no right and no wrong, that these moralistic conventions that we apply to the world are just a filter through which we see things. They're not actually in the world. And Aqua Teen is obsessed with this amorality. Our world is filled with despots and dictators who go to war at the drop of a hat. And when we go to war, it's often for fake or illegitimate reasons. Wars are perpetrated based on lies and to benefit the rich. They're abruptly ended at the expense of civilians and soldiers alike. The environment is deteriorating, the ice caps are melting, the forests are burning, the ocean levels are rising. Nothing makes sense, and it seems like everything is trying to kill us. And it's easy to lose track of whether I'm talking about our world or the world of Aqua Teen. Now, what's interesting is the confused reality of the world is actually really challenging to represent. News media, talk show hosts, reality TV, these forms regularly fail to give us the full scope of how chaotic and dangerous the world is. And it might be their seriousness that's undermining them. Maybe the fact that Aqua Teen was able to joke about this stuff is what let the creators of the show talk about the horrors of the world and the chaos of the world so easily. So formally, Aqua Teen is a horror parody or a sci-fi horror parody show. But I think there's more to Aqua Teen's brand of parody than just horror or sci-fi. As we've talked about, I think Aqua Teen is performing a much more philosophical and general kind of parody. But on the surface, that's what it's doing. It's taking horror and sci-fi tropes and satirizing them. So just for the sake of example, let's look at one particular episode of Aqua Teen and its use of fragmentation and its use of parody. It's called Kangarella and the Magic Tarantula. It's episode 10 of season 7. So this episode uses two simultaneous narratives that are disconnected from each other. One story is about Frylock and Shake playing a smartphone game, and the other story is about Meatwad discovering that their house is haunted by a very traditional poltergeist. The two stories occur simultaneously, but actively resist each other. After Meatwad discovers that the house is haunted, he tries to tell Shake and Frylock about the ghost, but they have no interest in the story. They're totally obsessed with their game. Frylock and Shake are standing in for the show itself in this, because the show is also resisting a traditional narrative. Usually in a story like this, one character will discover the haunting, they'll tell the other characters about it, and then they'll try to survive or resolve it, and they'll die or escape. There's a story, right? There's a discovery, there's an obstacle, there's a conflict, there's a resolution. None of that happens in this show. Meatwad discovers the house is haunted, he tells Shake and Frylock about it, and they don't give a shit. The episode ends, the house is haunted, that's it. So in this episode, Meatwad is naive. He sees a traditional plot and he wants to go with it. He wants to flow with the story and follow conventions. Shake and Frylock, like I said, are standing in for Aqua Teen itself in this episode as they express the show's values and resist the resolution of that plot. They're also the ones who resist the merging of the two plots. Meatwad wants the story to become unified. He wants it to start in two places. He wants the two groups of characters to come together to deal with the conflict and then hopefully resolve it or die trying. That obviously doesn't happen in this episode, and it's thanks to Shake and Frylock that we see this resistance. So built into this narrative convention of a beginning, middle, and end is a kind of ethic. There's a moral to these stories most of the time. The characters either succeed based on some ethical righteousness in themselves, or they fail based on some tragic flaw. Unsurprisingly, Aqua Teen doesn't conform to this moral standard. This is another way that it's subversive. These days, you often hear that a piece of media is amoral. You know, you've got an anti-hero in a superhero film. You've got an amoral protagonist like Tony Soprano, or you've got an amoral universe in a show like The Walking Dead. I don't think any of these shows deserve the title amoral. If anything on modern television is or was amoral, it was Aqua Teen Hunger Force. The show has zero ethical framework supporting it. There's never a distinction between right and wrong that isn't an illusion. There's no consistent punishment for misbehaving. Any kind of punishment or justice that's meted out is arbitrary. Now, granted, I'm sure that mass media is less moralistic than it used to be. I mean, we don't have the Hays Code forcing these happy endings onto movies anymore, like Detour. I'm not sure if you've seen Detour, but it's a pretty cool movie. It's a film noir, and it's about this amoral protagonist who does a lot of wrong throughout the film. And the filmmakers wanted him to get away at the end. They wanted him to just hitchhike off into the night. But the Hays Code, which was a censorship board in Hollywood, it forced a different ending on the movie, and we'll just take a look at it right now. As you can see, he would have gotten away with it if it weren't for those damn censors. So endings like this aren't being forced on filmmakers anymore, but there's still an ethical code that people follow when they make movies, just because we all share a kind of ethical framework that most of us aren't that interested in subverting and consciously or unconsciously want to propagate. So we don't necessarily need a censorship board to enforce ethics and morals in storytelling. To some extent, I think we've crowdsourced that out to the internet. Anyway, I'm dwelling on censorship because Aqua Teen starts out as a detective parody, as opposed to a horror sci-fi parody. Now, it drops that storyline within, I would say, an episode and a half, but that's what we're going to be talking about in our first real video, first non-introductory video on Aqua Teen Hunger Force. We're going to be talking about the first, say, 15 minutes of the show where the characters are trying to be detectives. And we're going to talk about how they discard that task almost immediately. And these beginnings as a detective show aren't accidental. Detective movies and film noir movies were extremely subversive. They would often try to get around the Hays Code. They would try to slip violence into movies, or they would try to put amoral kind of storylines and amoral characters into the movies and then see if they would get caught by the Hays Code, and some would and some wouldn't. So film noir and detective movies were always pushing the boundaries of what was ethical and what was right, and they were always a very subversive style of art. So I don't think it's a coincidence that Aqua Teen started his career as a subversive piece of art, as a detective narrative as opposed to a horror narrative. So yeah, that's just a little brief introduction to my project on Aqua Teen Hunger Force. I hope you stick around, and I hope you enjoy the videos to follow. This has been The Theory Creep. I'm The Theory Creep, and thanks for watching.